But fast forwarding to the election of 1824, this is personally my favorite aspect of Adams' presidency because I think Andrew Jackson is a fascinating character, and that is his friction and his intense rivalry with Andrew Jackson that stems and begins from the election of 1824. It's a very heated four-way election. Andrew Jackson gets the popular vote, but he didn't get the majority enough of the Electoral College to be elected president. So the election goes to the House, and there's some speculation on election corruption and stealing the election here because the House and Speaker of the House Henry Clay appoint Adams as president. So I'd like to talk about the election of 1824 here and that friction with Jackson. And I'd like to get your opinion on the election process and maybe some of the backroom deals that happened. Do you think that Adams partook in any sort of corruption with Henry Clay and cut a deal to get the election?
It's really hard. It's really hard to say, and I think people are kind of split on the issue. It's really hard to it's hard to make that determination. But in this particular situation, the Electoral College, after the votes, gives Jackson 99 votes. Adams comes in at 84 electoral votes, but unfortunately, nobody got a majority of votes. Jackson would need 32 more votes for a majority. So it goes to the House, okay? And now remember, Henry Clay at the time is a Speaker of the House, and so he's got some influence, and this is where this becomes murky. So Clay can guide things in a certain direction because of his influence as House Speaker. So once they vote Adams as president, and this is where things get suspicious, Adams then turns around and makes Clay his Secretary of State. So this is where Jackson just completely erupts. Okay, so he claims that there was a corrupt bargain made between Adams and Clay. And as a matter of fact, this is also an interesting part of this too. Clay believes that Jackson was not qualified to be president. Another interesting little piece in this little puzzle that nobody can really solve. And he certainly questioned Jackson's commitment to internal improvements like John Quincy Adams would do. So Jackson resigns his Senate seat and he vows to win the presidency in 1828. So by the time 1828 comes, Jackson wins by a landslide. He wins 95 electoral votes, and he becomes the president. And Adams limps back to Quincy. So anyway, so that causes a massive amount of what's the word I'm looking for? Aggravation between those two. Now later on, this is kind of funny, but not funny. So in 1833. Jackson is going to get an honorary degree from Harvard, which is Adams's alma mater. And you can only imagine what Adams felt about that. Adams, in his diary, calls it a disgrace. He calls Jackson. This is Adams's words. He's a barbarian who could not write a sentence of grammar and could hardly spell his name. So he does this throughout his diary about all different types of people. But that's the animosity between the two because Jackson's a slaveholder. He owns probably about 150 slaves, and he's also at the point of the movement of Native Americans westward. So you can see that there is just no love lost here whatsoever.
Man, I absolutely love it. I love the controversy. I love getting into it. It's also here where we start to see presidential campaigns because up until this point, it was sort of taboo to campaign for the presidency. It was seen as pandering to the voters, but because it was such a contentious election, really, it starts with Jackson. Adams still frowned upon this, but Jackson started campaigning and having rallies, and I know there was one instance that cracks me up. I believe it was in Philadelphia. I could be mistaken, but Adams was sleeping in a hotel or something, and not being planned. This is all coincidental, but right outside, Jackson was having a rally, and the chaos at the rally was actually keeping Adams awake. And I believe he wrote about his frustrations in his diary, which is just such a funny little anecdote to me. But Adams does get elected to the president by the House and Henry Clay, and I think this is where the controversy of stealing an election comes from, because like I mentioned earlier, it was a precedent that the Secretary of State would succeed the president. So I think Henry Clay cut a deal with Adams to give him the election in exchange for the Secretary of State position, thinking that he would succeed Adams. And I think that's where a lot of the conspiracies and the controversy comes from. But as president, Adams doesn't really achieve anything when we look back at it. I know he had some infrastructure plans, some domestic policy, but in the midterm elections of 1826, the Jacksonians really took over Congress. So Adams he had his hands tied as president. He really couldn't achieve anything, and ultimately ended up being, unfortunately, a forgettable one-term president. But did he achieve anything in the fight against slavery as president?
No, it was actually nothing really happened in regard to this. So during the campaign for president, he refused to comment publicly or privately about it. He refused to answer letters on the subject. He was very sensitive about not bringing it up to alienate certain voters, a certain block of voters. So the presidency of John Quincy Adams turns out to be really pretty much a disaster. Adams proposes this sweeping program of internal improvements that includes roads and canals, astronomical observatories, scientific explorations, uniform standard of weights and measures, a national university. All these things are fantastic things. But Adams stumbled here as well. He was not only met with opposition in Congress, but also the American people. So Adams's lack of political acumen at this time fails to sense that most Americans wanted less government. So he loses on that front as well. But the other thing in terms of slavery is that what's interesting here is that even though Adams's national improvement plans favored the developments of roads, canals, and harbors in the South, many of which would improve transportation of slave-grown products to market, Southerners always saw Adams as a harbinger of slavery's demise. Every action he took, they thought that he was trying to get rid of slavery. So by the time 1828 comes and he loses to Jackson, he's a defeated man, and he heads back to Quincy.